would you say, how do these retaliatory tariffs specifically impact U.S. farmers' income?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, farmers are in a very interesting place where they're subject to some cross-cutting winds on this issue. What I mean by that is, for decades, farmers have been victim of unfair trade. Farmers know that it has been unfair trade by China and many other countries that has uh, made it more difficult for them to get a fair price. In some cases, they have tariffs already in place. In other cases, we have countries like China that have been buying so much of our agricultural goods
Mm,
that they are able to hold us hostage and control the price. They will dump our products to push that price down. It also makes our food supply chain less resilient, which is of course really important in cases of disaster. So on the one hand, farms have been impacted by unfair trade for a long time, and some people would say that's an argument for getting tougher and for using tariffs at times to push for tougher trade deals. On the
mm,
other hand, you'll hear farmers and agriculture groups talk about how retaliatory tariffs, foreign retaliation from other countries, can impact them. So if America places a tariff on an incoming good from a certain country, and that country places retaliatory tariffs that increase the cost of American goods when they're sold abroad, that makes it harder for farmers to sell their goods. And many farmers in America, in addition to supplying food domestically, have to be able to export in order to be able to continue to keep their businesses going. And so you have farmers who are both hit by unfair trade and can be hit by foreign retaliation if negotiations on tariffs get out of control. That's why we really have to hope for the sake of our family farmers, regardless of what people think of politics, we really have to hope that the discussions over these trade deals with the UK, potentially with China and other places, can move forward and can yield trade agreements that put family farms first, because that
mm.
would be how we could put our food supply in this country first.
Absolutely. And so you know, one of the things that we were talking about is the crunch that family farms already were feeling. And now these tariffs, what impact do you see or are you hearing as far as the family farms and the struggle that they're going through?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this goes back to the deep, deep roots of the problem as spent time exploring, which is that we've had decades, a century now, of economic crises that have hit farms in ways that our country hasn't understood, and that affects our food supply. Of
Hmm.
governmental policies that have an impact on farms from both parties, both sides of the political aisle over time, and then ways that technology has needlessly left so many of our small family farmers behind because it has advanced a lot of American agriculture, but it's also needlessly focused on the type of technology that doesn't work for medium and small farms as well as the large farms. And so those economic crises, those governmental policies, and those technological issues have been piling up on the backs of our family farms for decades. Family farms have been dealing with higher prices and less ways to navigate that because of all of these problems. So when you get to where we are today, we've been losing farms at the rate of 45,000 per year on average for a century. That
Mm,
means we've lost 70% of our farms. And if we were to continue that going forward, we would lose most of our farms in the next 40 years. I'm 40 years old now. By the time my little girl is my age, we'll have lost most of the farms in this country if we don't do something to make a change. And so
mm.
that's why when we talk about tariffs and trade policy, it's so important that we get it right. It's so important that we have trade agreements that put family farms first so that we are able to figure out a way for our farms to continue forward on into the next generation.
Hmm. And if you can, in the beginning of your answer, can you tell us a little bit about some of the hurdles that family farms have had to overcome in the past? And can you give us an understanding of what is a family farm opposed to what might be a larger industrialized farm?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, family farms, they, just as a baseline, they face issues of inclement weather, weather that can bless or threaten. They face the threat of farmland accidents with machinery or animals
Mm,
that can cripple a farmer or one of his employees or children that can really stop a farm's operations completely. And then they face all of the uncertainty around prices going up and down, but rarely, if ever, keeping pace with costs. And so it gets harder and harder each year for farms to make it. Now, family farms are those that are owned by the families that operate them. So the families that live on those farms and operate those farms, those are family farms. And here's an interesting thing, and it's a reason for hope.
mm,
People are sometimes shocked to hear that 96% of our farms are still family farms in this country. 88% of them are small family farms in this country. And people are shocked by that.
Mm.
We've lost 70% of our farms because of losing 45,000 per year. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem that affects our supply chain, affects our food supply, all kinds of issues. But we've got nearly 2 million farm families left in this country who are still farming. People ask, how are they able to make it? Well, in many cases, they're working multiple jobs. So they might be working the farm as supplemental income, and then they're also working a factory shift, pouring concrete, working on a construction site, working a retail job, whatever the case may be. They're often working 2 to 3 jobs to be able to keep going. So we need to figure out a way for those farms to be able to face the challenges that farms face and to be able to move forward with growing entrepreneurial ventures again, so that it can be full-time income for those farm families, because otherwise those families aren't going to be able to afford to keep the farm going forever. And at some point, those farms are going to continue to disappear as they have been for the past century now.
Mm-hmm. And so as they disappear, what's happening to those farms? I mean, what is happening to those family farms as they disappear?
That's a great question. So in many cases, the farms are being bought up by other farms or by companies that hold that land. In other cases, the farms are going bankrupt and that farm might be bought and sold. It could be picked up by any number of other buyers. In some cases, those farms are shifting toward development, real estate, urban development. In some cases, those farms are simply lying fallow and becoming overgrown and going to waste. Now, in some of the most terrifying cases, we have that farmland being bought by foreign adversaries. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese Communist Party is an example of this, and other foreign adversaries are examples of this, where they will approach American farmers and they will purchase that farmland. And when they do that, that's creating food security and national security issues on a number of levels. First of all, they're getting their hands on our farmland, which is our means to grow our own domestic food supply. And secondly, in addition to threatening our food security, they're buying that land oftentimes near military installations, and that's not a coincidence. And so when you have foreign adversaries that are getting their hands on our farmland like that, it causes deep, deep problems on a number of levels, from our food security to our national security and beyond.
So, man, I mean, so now as we look at the struggle of the family farms and these tariffs, as we spoke in our first interview, farmers only have a small window. And so these tariffs, if they're not worked out, what is, I guess, the red line that these tariffs need to work out before farmers are really in a pinch?
It's such a good question. It's a crucial issue. It really depends on the crop or the product. In the case of beef, farmers need to have good prices for beef when they're selling it. And the UK trade deal does look at trying to open up the UK to more American beef exports. Mm-hmm. But if we don't have good trade deals around our beef, and that pushes the price of our beef down, that's a bad thing. Because if we can't sell our beef as many places because it's too expensive in other countries because of tariffs, it will depress the price of that beef. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that doesn't go too far. But as far as crops where there's really a time element to it, soybeans, corn often get harvested in the fall. So I would say that as we're coming into late summer, early fall, we need to know that we're going to have some good, strong trade deals, and there needs to be some relief so that those prices can be able to get back up and rally, so that farmers that planted their seed in the spring can have a good crop for their harvest in the fall. Farmers, they're gambling at the end of the day. A farm is a type of a casino at the end of the day, and the family farm doesn't run the casino. It's run by our broader economy. And so you plant in the spring, sometimes taking out debt to be able to afford the seed that you put in the ground so that you can harvest in the fall. And we need to be able to have good, strong prices by the time we get to the fall for corn and for soybeans and for a wide variety of other products. Produce that's harvested at various types of the year has the same types of issues. And, on issues like soybeans, you talk about how the timing is so precise. You're so right about that. Soybeans have to be harvested at precisely the right time from a moisture standpoint before they dry out too much and after they've dried sufficiently, so that they can be sold at the right moisture level if you're going to be able to get a good price for those soybeans. So timing is everything, and we have to make sure there's good, strong prices by the time our farms are harvesting their crops.
So I wanted to just read this real quick. It says, based on tariff impacts through January 2025, here are how different crops and states have been affected. So soybeans most heavily impacted. It says in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota. It says these top soybean producing states saw significant losses when China imposed retaliatory tariffs. Nebraska, Ohio, where I'm at, Missouri, also major soybean exporters that lost market share in China. China was previously the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, so the retaliatory tariffs had widespread impact across the Midwest.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Well, I was going to say this shows the number of levels upon which we have problems when it comes to China. So first of all, China is our largest trading partner. So they buy the largest amount of American agricultural products. And that means that more and more and more of our farmers and the price for their goods depend upon China continuing to buy. And China for many years has been willing to suddenly dump American products and push that price down. That's on top of all kinds of unfair trade practices like manipulating their currency and cheating on trade standards that they're willing to do. In addition to the fact that they buy up, as I mentioned, American farmland, and they buy up a lot of American U.S. Treasury, meaning they buy up a lot of American debt. So China is trying to use its economic clout to create a lot of problems for the American people, including for our family farms. But here's the problem. If we don't find a way to strike a trade deal with them that opens up more fair markets and holds them to tougher standards, they can shut down trade with us in a big way. And that causes a big problem. And that's what you hear some of the soybean organizations talking about. You hear them especially vocal. And so we need to be able to negotiate with China in a way that's tough, that draws a good hard line, but make sure that we can open that market back up, get that market open in a fair way so that our soybean farmers in particular are able to sell their crops and other products to China.
And so another thing that most people might not recognize and may not understand is not only because we hear China made, a lot is made in China, including most people might not even have thought about this, the farming equipment. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that is that a part of this whole tariff, tariff war?
Well, it goes back to showing all the ways that our supply chain runs through China, and one of the ways that creates vulnerabilities. There are so many types of farm equipment, goods that America buys, and that's the other side of the tariff issue. So we were talking about what happens when retaliatory tariffs from other countries increase the cost of selling goods abroad, and that means that fewer countries are buying our goods, and that pushes the price down, and farmers can lose out if we lose control of those negotiations. The other thing that can happen is American tariffs. It can encourage domestic industry, which is part of the idea behind it, but also it can increase the cost of goods that we're importing into this country. There's a couple of examples. One is a lot of the goods that China makes that family farms, but also all American families depend upon to some degree being able to buy affordably. They're going to have to find another place to buy those products affordably if it's not going to be from China. And there are other examples of this. Canada is one of the biggest, actually it's the biggest provider of what's known as potash. This is potassium. This is potash fertilizer that's put onto our fields. And so we get 90%, roughly 90% of our potash from Canada. And this is an example where family farms speaking up has been able to help impact things because we get so much potash from Canada. And having that potash from Canada being more expensive because of tariffs that we've put on Canadian goods was going to cause a real problem for farmers. And so a lot of farm groups are speaking up about that. And you did see the federal government make an exception where they said, okay, we're not going to have the same kind of tariffs on potash as we are on other Canadian goods. So this is an example why we need to be speaking up, talking about, yes, there's unfair trade, we got to deal with that, but also we need to make sure that we're not making trade more difficult to the point that it makes it harder for family farms to be able to make it. That's what that potash issue would have done if that policy change hadn't been enacted.
So for many of us, we may not know that. What is potash?
Potash, yeah, that's a great question. Potash is a source of potassium that is used, it's spread on fields, and it puts more potassium back into the fields. When you have crops like corn or a number of other crops that are grown in the soil, the corn draws nutrients out of that soil. And part of having a good, healthy balance and a healthy soil is making sure that you can find ways to get nutrients back into the soil. Now, there's a lot of ways to do that. Many of them are natural, and those are the best ways. So you'll have corn on a piece of ground for maybe a season, and then you might have hay, or you might have soybeans, you might have other products that, because some crops draw nutrients out of the soil and other crops put those nutrients back in the soil. So that's one really important thing to do. There's all kinds of other natural methods. One of the other ways is through fertilizers, and potash is one of those that puts potassium back in the soil. Now, there's a big debate in American agriculture right now over what type of fertilizer to use. There's, I'll call it hard chemicals, is one type of fertilizer. And that's the kind that you hear people getting concerned about, worried that it is affecting our food, that it's hurting our soil in a long-term way.
Right.
And then there's also more natural, what I would say, some are called biologicals, where it's a biological type agent that's being used in the field. It's more natural. There's also organic and natural fertilizers. You can use animal, what we call it cow shit where I'm from. You can use animal manure. There's also ways to use natural products like whey. So whey is a byproduct of making cheese. Where I'm from, they milk a lot of cows, and that milk goes toward making cheese, and the byproduct of that cheese is whey. And so you can spread whey on field as well. So there's all kinds of, all across the spectrum, from hard chemicals over more natural substances that are being used to try to get nutrients back into our soil. And what I always say is any good farmer wants to have as healthy a soil as they can. And so we need to find ways to have solutions for farmers to be able to do that affordably.
Right. And like you said, which is another program, really, when you're talking about those hard chemicals, there is a big backlash that is taking place. And where, I think that, farmers that want to grow organic, if you will, that word organic, it seems as though from what I'm hearing is that they're not as subsidized and backed as those who use those hard chemicals from, these pharmaceutical industries. So I guess that's another story right there. But definitely, like you said, which is another concern that I'm reading about, is the soil in America is, there's an issue with the soil being able to reproduce. I guess I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but to be able to grow food, the soil has to be taken care of properly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, and farmers are constantly wrestling with these issues. And, you touched on another really important debate going on in American agriculture too, which is, we've got the Make America Healthy Again movement. And I think that is in part a reflection of the fact that a lot of more people care about where the food comes from than ever before. And they're trying to find ways to have local, regional, specialty, alternative food markets, places that they can buy food that they know where it comes from, or that they know is healthy, or is a particular variety that they really enjoy. And, moving in that direction is a good thing. We do need to make sure that we do that in a way that small businesses, which is what family farms are able to make that transition. So if you have a family farm that doesn't have a whole lot of money to start with, and each year they've got maybe a small amount of money, if any, that they can set aside in savings, or that they can use to buy equipment, or whatever the case may be, they're going to have to make a transition if they're going to grow a new crop or product, a new type of food. And so if they're going to do that, they've got to be able to gamble that money. And it is a gamble. There's risk to it. So they're taking a small amount of money that they have, and they're taking a risk on a new type of crop or product. We need to make sure the demand is there. And that's why it's really important that anybody who cares about where their food comes from takes a step toward our farmers. They look to buy beef or crops or other products from local farmers down the road, buy produce from local farmer down the road, go to a farmer's market where you can buy food from local farmers, stop by a local butcher shop, go to grocery stores that'll carry local goods, because many of them will carry local goods if they know that people will buy it. Support farm to table restaurants. Do all these things to take a step toward the American farmer. And if the American farmer is able to grow more crops and products that people want to buy here in this country, that creates new entrepreneurial opportunity, because so many of our farms are locked into growing crops or products that they used to grow and that are really in broken markets that don't support them as much anymore. They have income from it. They know where to sell it, but it isn't enough income to cover their costs. And so we need to have entrepreneurial opportunity for our farmers.
Right. They're kind of like handcuffed, is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, I think one of the things that you just said, I think there really needs to be some type of movement, really, to support, local farms. There really needs to be some type of movement. So, saying that, do you think that the mainstream media focuses enough on, the plight of family farms and the struggle that they're going through, or do you think that it's not reported as it really should be? Because
It's
let's
def-
face it,
yeah,
I just wanted to say that the
please.
Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan said that farms are the engine of a nation. They're
Yeah.
the engine of a nation. And I think that, as we begin to see these family farms disappearing, I think we're going to find out what the engine of a nation, what that really means.
Yeah. It's a deeply underreported story. Now, I have to say, I am grateful for every ounce of attention that the book has gotten. And we've been able to be part of some national conversations. We've been able to really talk with farm families all across the country, and we've been able to engage policymakers and others. So there's been a lot of national attention on this conversation more recently. I'm grateful for every bit of that, but it's still a deeply underreported story because this has been going on for a century. We've been losing
Mhm.
farms at the rate of 45,000 per year for a century, and nobody has really acknowledged that. There was a brief time period during the 1980s with the farm crisis when we were losing tens of thousands of farms needlessly because of government policy, that our country paid attention to it. And then more recently, during some of the trade disputes, there's been some more discussion as well. I'm glad that there's that discussion, but we need to have a deeper look at this issue. We need to see what's going on the farms on the ground, how that affects our broader food supply across the entire country. And you and I have talked about this last time, but the vulnerability of our food supply chain is very real. Our supply chain is a modern miracle in certain ways. It supplies any type of food, any time of year, any part of the country. That's a modern miracle. At the
Mm.
same time, it's deeply vulnerable because as we've lost more and more of our farms, 45,000 per year, it has led to fewer ways for the food to get from the farm gate to the dinner table. We have a lot of really big industries that are dominated by concentrated industries, and so you have one great big distribution center that goes down, for instance, that
Mhm.
locks up a whole lot of our food, and that's why it is difficult during COVID or difficult during bird flu and other disasters to find the food that we need in the grocery store. And if you can find it, it's much more expensive. It's because of that supply chain getting locked up. So
Mm.
we've got to be able to find a way to make our food supply chain more resilient. The best way to do that is to support small family farms across this country, having more entrepreneur opportunity for them so that they can grow crops and products and food that the American consumer wants to buy and is able to have better access to during a disaster.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to before we go into some more, I wanted to talk about another issue that the farmers are facing, and that is the immigration issue. Most people don't know that there are certain crops that just can't be picked by machines. They have to be picked by hand. And so, can you talk a little bit about this whole immigration and how that's affecting the farmers as well?
Yeah, a really good example of a crop that is difficult to pick by machine is tomatoes. They're easily bruised, they're easily torn.
Mm-hmm.
Some types of peppers you can pick by hand, others you can't. So the list goes on and on. And what it really nets out to is that about half of our farm workforce is immigrant labor.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue that we have is, unfortunately, because Washington hasn't done its job, hasn't rolled up its sleeve to find a bipartisan solution, farmers are, again, caught in a cross cutting wind. On the one hand, there are many farmers from rural areas who would like to have a secure border. They tend to support that. On the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, they do have a need for a workforce, and some of that workforce, it can't be accounted for whether they have legal status or not. And
Mm-hmm.
so we need to have a situation where we solve this issue at the federal level, where farmers are able to have the labor that they need from hardworking families who want to come here and find a way up. And
Mm-hmm.
also, we're able to have this federal policy dilemma solved. So if we aren't able to do that, the reality is that we're going to have a lot of fruits and vegetables and other types of crops that can't be picked in this country. And that's going to cause a real problem for our farms that are trying to find a way forward. And it's going to cause a problem for our food supply as well.
Mm-hmm. And when you talked about that supply chain, I remember seeing, just fruits and vegetables and corn and things like that just rotting in the fields. And it was very sad and difficult to see, because there are a lot of Americans who are food insecure. And like you said, with that supply chain, um, you know, being not localized, that makes it very difficult for some people to get food, and in a country that produces an abundance of food. And when I say an abundance of food, I forget I forget how much food is thrown away in America. And so this definitely, it doesn't need to happen. It needs to be resolved. Let's go into a little bit more of these tariffs then. um and so I guess what I want to ask now is getting into a very difficult topic. It's very difficult because many people don't know when they talk about the strain that the farmers, local farmers, family farms are under. We've heard of the suicide rate or ideation. And we've heard many times that it's the veterans, but what many people may not know is that I don't know if they're neck and neck now, because I'm hearing that, right under that is farmers. Can you talk a little bit about this incredible strain that is on individuals who produce what we see on our plates every evening?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking about that. You're right; it's a difficult topic. I really appreciate you asking. In the opening pages of Land Rich Cash Poor, we tell the story of my dad struggling with that very issue. I want to start by saying that he's alive and well, and I'm grateful for that. But
Yeah.
we had a transition that our farm was going through where we were still going to hold on to our land and find ways to farm it, but we were selling our cows, and we had milked cows for more than 100 years on our land. And so my dad was going to be waking up that morning, and he wasn't going to be milking cows, and that was the first time that our family had ever done that, sent the cows down the road like that. And so my dad was struggling with that issue of farmer suicide. Farmers are typically in the top five among industries as far as the kind of mental stress involved in committing suicide. And my dad was struggling with that issue. And I was standing with him the morning after we sold our cows, standing on the porch of my cabin right out back of the farmhouse where we both grew up. And we were standing there, and I was wondering if he was struggling with that. And he
Mm,
was. And we were right
mm.
next to each other, but we may as well have been a world apart because we couldn't talk about it. I was afraid to ask, and he didn't feel able to raise it. But he got through it by thinking about the next generation, his grandkids. And our family had learned from the loss of other families that you have to talk about this thing. So we worked through things, we talked through things. And he ultimately found a path forward. And I'm grateful to say that he's alive and well today. But
Mm.
talking about the dark depths of that mental health crisis, which is really a silent crisis in rural America, is something that I felt that we needed to talk about. And my dad, I'm so grateful to him for telling that story. I discovered that he'd been dealing with that problem to that level when I
Mm.
was doing the research for the book. And we talked about whether we wanted to share it. And my dad said that, we've got to tell people the whole truth. We decided we want to tell the honest story. And part of the reason we did that is so that people know that they're not alone if they're struggling with that, whether they're farmers or any other walk of life, but especially in rural areas.
Right. And what is it that is causing this angst, if you will, for these farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. So every farm family deals with the deep dilemma of what it means to be land rich, cash poor, which is why I picked that for the title of the book, which is to say, you got this land that's so valuable, but it's harder and harder each year to make a living on it. So every farm family, especially guys like my dad, they are holding on and know that one day they'll face a scenario where they aren't able to provide for their family anymore.
Mm.
Or they can sell their land, in which case they turn around and lose everything else. Because when you grow up on a farm like I did, a farm is not just your dad's job, it's your home, it's your community, it's your heritage. And
Mhm.
so farmers don't want to do that if they can at all help it. And so that's the first thing, is that they're facing that dilemma. And then also it piles up every generation. The stories that we tell about our family, you look back through it and you say, boy, great grandpa escaped pre-World War I Europe, and got through poverty. Grandpa survived the depression and climbed in the middle class. Mom and dad made it through the farm crisis in the 1980s. Why can't I make it? So you feel that compounding pressure every single generation. And so farm families are carrying that around, and it contributes to a very deep mental health crisis.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. Like you said, the farm, there's so much that comes with it. It's really beyond just, growing crops on a physical level. It's a spiritual level.
That's right.
It's communing with nature. It is, like like they say with, young people who may not experience, even growing anything, when you take them and you take them to a plot, and they are able to put a seed in the ground, and to see that seed grow, and then to see it produce a fruit, and then to bite it. It's so many different levels to it. And so this is something that if a person has never really experienced, they may not understand how deeply connected, human beings are to the land.
That's absolutely right. I think about my dad when we talk about the resilience of our farm families across the country. I think about my dad. When my dad was 8, my grandpa slipped off a corn crib and broke his back.
Mm.
And he did get back up on his feet, but not before my dad, at the tender age of 8, started doing the work of a man. And he hasn't quit since. And that's real hardship for a young boy like that. But at the same time, my dad, if he's not on the back of a tractor right now, he's running to get there. And
Right.
he loves working the land. He loves working with his animals. And there's a beauty to the way of life. I remember, working with my dad from sun up to sundown, and getting to see him help deliver a calf when a cow was having a hard time in labor, and see the first moments of life. And so when you are going through that kind of a spiritual experience of seeing God's miracles come up from the ground and working closely with animals and that sort of thing, it really does mean a lot. And I think that's actually part of the reason that family farms mean so much to our country. The American farmer really means something in this country, or at least used to. And I think to many people it still does. They just don't realize what's happening to our farmers. And so if you think about it that way, and all the ways that many of our values and so much of our identity as a country go back to the American farmer, well, then really we're not just losing the farms that feed us, but we're losing a part of ourselves along the way. And I think that gets back to what Aaron was saying about the way that so many people have been left behind. There are a lot of parts of the country that have been left behind economically. And one of the first is farm country. This began a century ago when we started losing our farms. Then a lot of our small towns that have been built by our farms began to lose population and shrink. By the time we started losing manufacturing jobs and other types of job loss, farms have been disappearing for a century. And so there's a lot of really, really difficult economic decline that's been going on for a very long time.
Okay. So as we begin to wrap this up, let's get into the financial aspect of it. So how are farmers managing their financial relationship with banks and equipment dealers during this period of reduced income and increased cost? So this is, like I said, when we think about this is reduced income. I
Yeah.
want people to think of just their home, reduced income and increase in cost. So, we all say that, we see inflation, but we don't see that inflation when it comes down to how much we're getting paid. We don't see that inflation in our checks. So, but for farmers, it's even more critical because once again, they supply our food.
Yeah, that's right. Well, farmers, whenever the American consumer is facing a crunch, families across the country are facing a crunch, farmers are facing the same crunch because they've got increases in all the same types of goods that any family is trying to buy for their dinner table and for their pantry. And also, they're paying for seed, feed, fertilizer, energy, all kinds of things. And so, farmers are really facing a very deep crunch. The way that they're managing their finances is really, really carefully. The question always is, my dad would call it penciling out. Does it pencil out? Where if you are figuring out whether you're going to be able to afford something, is it going to help pay for itself by creating efficiencies at your farm or not? And when farmers are taking out debt, they have to be really, really careful. And it's very difficult right now, more so than it ought to be. And here's why. Farmers will get loans from banks like anybody else, but there's also different government programs that will provide lending and government programs that just affect lending. Like knowing how different government programs are going to work affects the price in the market. So a lot of lenders need to know that information to be able to make a good loan. Well, we're in a situation where we haven't had a new farm bill for far too long. We're supposed to have a new one every 5 years, and it's supposed to set the policy around these programs for the next 5 years.
Right.
Congress has not been doing its job, has not been passing a farm bill. So we need both parties to come together and find a way to pass that farm bill, because what's happening is while that farm bill isn't being passed, farmers are having a harder time getting a loan. It
Mm,
is more difficult for government lenders and for private sector lenders, whichever you're in favor of. It's more difficult for all those lenders to be able to lend money to farmers when we don't have a farm bill that's defining how the industry is going to work going forward.
mm-mm. Yeah. And so one thing that many people may not know is that, farmers, when we're talking about loan, for these new seasons, if you will. So the farmers, they've already, got this loan out, and what they're banking on is a crop that they'll be able to make a profit and pay off that loan. Is that right?
You're so right about that. That's exactly right. That goes back to the gamble that farmers face. And we've had times in our history where it's become even worse. I'll explain. So, a farmer, oftentimes they will have to take out an operating loan in the spring,
Mm-hmm.
and they will plant their seed. They'll buy their seed and plant their seed, and then they'll harvest the crop in the fall. And that's when they're able to pay off the loan. Well, here's something that happened in the 90s, and that's very hard to do. That's a gamble. If you have a crop ruined and you have that
Right.
debt, that can do all kinds of things to put a farm under, as you can imagine. Just like if you suddenly have a mortgage you can't pay on your home, same kind of
Mm,
idea. Well, in the 1980s, it got even worse. We had both parties by that time, both political parties, have been telling farms to get bigger or get out by the time
mm,
we got to the 1980s. And one of the ways they made it encouraging to farms to get bigger was to encourage lending through government programs. So they were saying to farmers, "Hey, take out more debt so you can buy more land, so you can buy more animals." Well, within a few years of encouraging that debt, they increased interest rates. They were trying to control inflation, just like we saw in the last couple of years. So if you raise the interest rate, that can help control inflation. Well, you
mm,
can argue for or against those things. You can think that we should have government programs encouraging lending or shouldn't, and you can think that we need to increase the interest rate or not. But the reality is, when you do those two things at the same time, you have government programs pushing debt on farmers, and then all of a sudden you're raising the interest rate and making that debt more expensive. You drive tens of thousands of farms out of business. And that's what happened during the farm crisis in the 1970s, 1980s.
mm-hmm. And so I guess to wrap it up, and I probably have maybe one more question after that, but the government, I know that during COVID, the government came to the rescue to some degree and helped farmers. But how does it look as far as these tariffs are concerned? What way is the government helping to, support farmers if the unfortunate happens and this doesn't, this tariff doesn't happen in a timely manner? Because like we said, there's this season, this window that's closing by September, I believe, right? Or is it November?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the crop or product, but late
Yeah.
summer, I would
Yeah.
like to have a lot of that sorted out. So, if we have trade disputes spin out of control and we have a harder time for our farmers, there is a lot of talk about an aid package that is designed to make whole as much as you can the farmers who have lost out because of lower prices as a result of trade disputes. There was millions of dollars spent on this during the last set of trade disputes that our country had. And there is talk about more of that. Now, what the American farmer would love, and I think everybody would like this, the American farmer would love is to be able to just be able to grow their crop and be able to sell it, food and fiber and other types of products, without needing that government assistance. But the
Mm,
reality is that if government action is causing the issue, it makes sense on some level for farmers to take assistance that can help them get through it. Now, this gets back to a much deeper issue on the involvement of government in agriculture. It's very, very deep ever since the Great Depression.
mm,
And some people applaud that and some people don't applaud that. But here's what's happened: our government programs have piled up one after the other, year after year. And we really haven't done deep reform to them in a very long time. So we don't know which programs are working anymore. We don't know which programs contradict one another, because some of them do. And we don't know which programs, have become prone to favoritism and abuse, because that
mm,
happens over time. And so as a result, we don't have government programs that are functioning the way they ought to. You got the American taxpayer in many cases asking, "Hey, where in the hell is my tax money going?" And
mhm,
you got the American family farm saying, "Hey, where in the hell is the assistance that was supposed to be coming?" So we need to have, what I've said is, we need to have a bipartisan family farm moonshot, where we examine each one of these programs and say, is it working the way it's supposed to? If it is, do we want to continue doing that? If it isn't, how do we reform it or get rid of it? so we can put more money back into the pocket of the American taxpayer, or find some other way to be able to create opportunity for farmers to be able to keep going.
Hmm. So, wow. Okay. Well, is there anything that we may have left out in this conversation?
Well, I love these conversations because this was so in depth and we covered so deeply the challenges facing our farms and how that affects all of us in terms of the health and
Mhm.
the price and the security of our food. So I appreciate it very much.
Right, right. Well, I thank you for coming on and you know, discussing this issue with us. I think, you know, I would like to just see more media attention to the plight of the farmers and what they're struggling through, because I think, once again, when we talk about the mental health of the farmers, I think that it just really doesn't make any sense in my mind when you have individuals who are producing a product that literally is keeping the nation alive, and yet they're being, from my vantage point, they're being ignored as far as their plight and their struggle is concerned. So I want to thank you, first of all, of course, for writing that book, because I think that really puts a spotlight on the struggle of family farms and how much they're needed. So
Thank you so
I'll
much.
give you the parting words. If you want to say anything to farmers, government, go right ahead.
Well, I really appreciate it. I do think that there are reasons for hope. We've got nearly 2 million farm families left, and they are finding ways forward as much as they can, even though we've deliberately made the economics not work in this country. Imagine what they could do, what they could accomplish for the American people if we make it work. So, anybody who picks up the book, I appreciate it. You can find Land Rich Cash Poor on Amazon, anywhere else you buy books online. You can also find it in bookstores all across the country. And if anybody does pick it up and enjoys it, I would really appreciate if they left a review on Amazon. I can't tell you how much that does to get the word out and make sure the more people see it and shed light on these issues. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is just spread the word on these issues and see if we can't do something about it by getting the word out there.
Absolutely. And before you go, let people know how they can contact you to talk more about this on their program.
Absolutely. You can find me on my website at www.brian-reisinger.com. That's spelled Brian-Reisinger, Reisinger.com. I'm also on X at Brian J. Reisinger. And if you do contact me on my website, I promise it is me who's there answering and getting in touch with people. I appreciate it. I've heard from farm families and people who care about where their food comes from all across the country. And I just appreciate the opportunity to have a dialogue with people.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on once again to talk about this important topic. I know you're a family man, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you once again. And hopefully we can have another conversation. And I would love to do like a little round table on this program
Oh,
with
yeah.
yourself and some other individuals to talk about how we can really begin a movement to support, family farms. So thank you, Mr. Reisinger, and be blessed. All right.
Thank you so much. Bless you. Thank you for raising these issues. And I'd love to come back on and engage in conversation with anybody wanting to mix it up on these issues. So thanks very much for all you do.
All right. Take care.